The blade of the plow struck something solid beneath the Turkish soil on an otherwise unremarkable autumn morning in 1994, sending a jarring vibration up through the wooden handles and into the calloused hands of a farmer who had worked this land for decades, without ever suspecting that beneath his feet lay a secret that would shatter every comfortable assumption humanity had constructed about its own origins, about the neat and orderly progression from primitive cave dweller to civilized architect, about the very timeline of consciousness itself. What the farmer had struck was not just another limestone outcropping in the rocky terrain of southeastern Anatolia, but rather the top of a megalithic pillar that had been standing in silent testimony beneath accumulated earth and debris for more than 11,000 years, waiting with the patience that only stone possesses for the moment when human curiosity would once again turn its attention to this wind-swept hill called Göbekli Tepe, a name that translates with almost prophetic accuracy to Potbelly Hill, a designation so mundane and unremarkable that it seems almost cosmically ironic, given what lay hidden there. The farmer, whose name has been largely lost to history, in the way that the names of those who stumble upon world-changing discoveries often are, simply saw an obstacle to his livelihood, another stone that needed to be cleared so that crops could grow in neat and profitable rows. And he reported the finding to local authorities with the same casual concern that one might report a fallen tree blocking a country road, never imagining that he had just announced the existence of what would come to be recognized as quite possibly the most important archaeological site ever discovered. A place that would force scholars and scientists to completely rewrite the story they had been telling about who we are and where we came from. But the stone the farmer found was no ordinary obstacle. And when Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist working for the German Archaeological Institute, first visited the site in 1994, after hearing reports of unusual stone formations, he experienced what can only be described as a moment of profound and disorienting recognition, the kind of epiphany that comes perhaps once in a lifetime to those who dedicate themselves to understanding the past. A sudden, visceral understanding that he was standing on the threshold of something that would consume the rest of his professional life and challenge everything he thought he knew about the capabilities of ancient humans. Schmidt, who had spent years excavating Nevalachuri, another significant Neolithic site in the region, possessed the trained eye necessary to recognize that what he was looking at was not some natural geological formation or the remains of a forgotten medieval structure, but rather something far older and far more significant than anything that should exist in this time period, according to every established timeline of human development. And he made the decision that very day to abandon his other projects and devote himself entirely to uncovering whatever lay beneath the surface of this unremarkable hill in the middle of nowhere. What emerged from the earth over the following years of excavation would prove to be nothing less than an archaeological impossibility. A structure so sophisticated and so ancient that its very existence seems to violate the fundamental laws of how civilizations are supposed to develop, rising as it does from a period when humans were allegedly living in small nomadic bands, following migrating herds of animals across vast landscapes, possessing no permanent settlements, no written language, no wheel, no pottery, no domesticated animals beyond perhaps the dog, and certainly no ability to quarry, transport, and erect massive stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, carved with intricate, three-dimensional reliefs of animals, and adorned with T-shaped capitals that suggest an architectural sophistication that should not appear in the archaeological record for another 6,000 or 7,000 years. The pillars themselves stand as mute testimony to capabilities that shouldn't exist in this era, each one a precisely carved T-shape rising from circular or oval enclosures, arranged with geometric precision, some standing as tall as 18 feet and bearing decorations that include foxes, lions, wild boars, gazelles, snakes, and vultures, rendered with an artistic skill that rivals anything produced by supposedly more advanced civilizations thousands of years later. And the sheer weight of these monuments staggers the imagination when you consider that moving a 20-ton stone today, with cranes and hydraulic lifts and diesel engines and all the accumulated mechanical knowledge of modern engineering, is still considered a significant logistical challenge. To put this in perspective that might resonate with our modern sensibilities, imagine discovering that the internet was actually invented not in the late 20th century by computer scientists building on generations of mathematical and engineering knowledge, but rather in 1823 by candlelight in someone's basement, using tools made from wood and stone. And imagine further that this discovery was not the achievement of a settled civilization, with universities and libraries and accumulated knowledge, but rather was created by people who technically didn't even have permanent addresses, because they were still living in temporary camps and moving with the seasons. And you begin to approach the level of cognitive dissonance that Göbekli Tepe creates in anyone who seriously contemplates what its existence means. The dating of the site, confirmed through multiple methodologies, including radiocarbon analysis of organic materials found in the mortar and fill, places the construction of the oldest enclosures at approximately 9,600 BCE, which means that when the builders of Göbekli Tepe were hoisting their massive pillars into place and carving their intricate animal reliefs, Stonehenge would not be built for another 6,000 years. The Great Pyramids of Egypt would not rise for another 7,000 years. And the entire recorded history of civilization as we typically understand it, with its cities and kings and written languages and monumental architecture, lay thousands of years in the future, an unimaginable expanse of time that makes Göbekli Tepe as ancient to the builders of the pyramids as the pyramids are to us. The implications of this timeline are difficult to overstate, because every model of human development that archaeologists and anthropologists have constructed over the past century follows a relatively straightforward progression. First come small bands of hunter-gatherers living hand to mouth. Then, gradually, some groups begin to experiment with cultivating plants and herding animals. Then, agriculture allows for food surpluses, which enable permanent settlements. Then permanent settlements grow into villages, which grow into towns, which grow into cities. And only then, after all these prerequisite developments have occurred, do you get the social organization and accumulated resources necessary to undertake massive construction projects that serve primarily religious or ceremonial purposes, rather than immediate survival needs. Göbekli Tepe shatters this comfortable narrative because it appears to flip the entire sequence on its head, presenting us with monumental architecture that precedes agriculture, with massive organized labor projects that precede permanent settlements, with artistic sophistication that precedes pottery, and with evidence of complex religious or philosophical thought that precedes writing, forcing us to confront the possibility that everything we thought we understood about the necessary preconditions for civilization might be fundamentally wrong, or, at the very least, incomplete. The structures themselves follow a consistent architectural pattern across multiple enclosures, with two massive central pillars standing in the middle of circular or oval arrangements of slightly smaller pillars, all connected by low stone walls and benches, creating enclosed ceremonial spaces that could accommodate perhaps dozens or even hundreds of participants. And the fact that this pattern repeats across multiple enclosures with such consistency suggests not random experimentation, but rather deliberate planning, institutional knowledge, and probably some form of architectural tradition passed down from master to apprentice, which in turn suggests a level of social complexity that simply should not exist among people who were supposedly living in temporary camps and spending most of their time and energy on the immediate concerns of finding food and avoiding predators. Perhaps even more perplexing than the construction itself is the fact that these magnificent structures, these monuments that represented such an enormous investment of human labor and ingenuity, were deliberately buried, intentionally filled in with debris and soil around 8000 BCE, by people who carefully placed the fill material so as not to damage the pillars or disturb the carvings, preserving them almost perfectly for millennia, in a way that suggests the burial was not an act of destruction or vandalism, but rather something more like reverent entombment, as if whoever filled in these enclosures wanted to ensure they would survive intact into some distant future. Which raises the absolutely haunting question of why anyone would undertake such a massive project, only to bury it 1,000 or 1,500 years later. This is not a case of gradual abandonment or natural decay, or destruction by conquering enemies, scenarios that archaeologists are well equipped to recognize and interpret, but rather appears to be a deliberate and careful act of preservation through concealment. Roughly equivalent to if modern civilization were to build the International Space Station at enormous cost and effort, and then, instead of using it or letting it fall into the atmosphere or repurposing it for something else, we decided to carefully lower it into the ocean and cover it with sand. An analogy that captures something of the profound strangeness of this decision to bury what was clearly a site of enormous importance and significance. The various theories that have been proposed to explain this deliberate burial range from the mundane to the fantastical, including the possibility that climate change or resource depletion forced the inhabitants to abandon the area, that new religious beliefs replaced the old traditions and the site was ritually closed, that warfare or social upheaval made continued use impossible, or even that the burial was an intentional time capsule, a way of preserving knowledge or marking an important event for future generations. But none of these explanations feel entirely satisfactory when you contemplate the sheer effort that would have been required to fill in these massive structures with thousands of tons of debris and soil. Standing at Göbekli Tepe today, looking at the excavated pillars rising from the earth like silent sentinels guarding secrets they have kept for 100 centuries, you cannot help but feel that you are in the presence of something that challenges not just academic theories about the development of civilization, but something deeper, something that speaks to our fundamental assumptions about human nature and human capabilities, about whether progress is linear or cyclical, about whether we are the culmination of a long upward climb from ignorance to enlightenment, or whether we might be, in some ways, relearning skills and recovering knowledge that was once possessed and then lost, perhaps multiple times, across the vast span of human existence. And as the sun sets over the Anatolian plateau, casting long shadows across the ancient stones, you realize that perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Göbekli Tepe is not what it tells us about the distant past, but rather what it suggests about the nature of knowledge itself and the fragility of human achievement. Because if a civilization capable of creating such monuments could vanish so completely that we didn't even know it existed until a farmer's plow struck stone in 1994, what else might be hidden beneath our feet? And what achievements of our own current civilization might be similarly forgotten if the right combination of catastrophe and time were to erase the records we have so carefully constructed? The engineering challenges that faced the builders of Göbekli Tepe, the sheer physical impossibility of what they accomplished with the tools they supposedly possessed, demands an explanation that our current models of human history simply cannot provide. Which is why the next chapter must examine, in excruciating detail, exactly what would have been required to quarry, transport, and erect these massive stones, and why every attempt to replicate these feats using period-appropriate technology has failed or required modifications that suggest we are missing something crucial about who these people really were and what they were truly capable of achieving. The moment you begin to seriously contemplate the physical logistics of what the builders of Göbekli Tepe actually accomplished, rather than simply marveling at the antiquity of the site or admiring the artistry of the carvings, you find yourself confronting a series of engineering problems so severe and so apparently insurmountable, given the technological constraints of the era, that the entire enterprise starts to feel less like ancient history and more like an elaborate magic trick where you know something impossible has occurred right before your eyes, but cannot, for the life of you, figure out how the magician managed to pull it off. Except in this case, the magician has been dead for 11,000 years and left behind no instruction manual, no blueprints, no written records of any kind. Only the towering physical evidence of stones that, by all rights, should not have been movable by people who supposedly possessed nothing more sophisticated than stone tools and leather ropes. The pillars at the heart of Göbekli Tepe are not merely large stones, but genuine megalithic monuments, with the largest examples weighing approximately 20 tons, which translates to roughly 40,000 pounds, or the equivalent weight of 3 full-size modern SUVs stacked vertically. And these are not rough-hewn boulders that could perhaps be rolled or dragged with relative ease, but rather precisely carved T-shaped monoliths, extracted from bedrock through controlled fracturing techniques, shaped into their distinctive forms through countless hours of grinding and pecking with stone tools, and then somehow transported from the quarry site to the construction location across uneven terrain, before being raised into perfectly vertical positions where they have stood without falling for more than 100 centuries. A feat that would be considered impressive, even if accomplished by a modern construction crew with hydraulic cranes, diesel-powered trucks, laser levels, and computer-aided engineering calculations. The quarry itself, located on the lower slopes of the ridge where Göbekli Tepe sits, still contains several unfinished pillars in various stages of extraction, frozen in time like ancient industrial accidents. And these incomplete monuments provide tantalizing clues about the extraction methodology employed by the builders, showing clear evidence of intentional groove cutting around the perimeter of the desired pillar, followed by the insertion of wooden wedges into these grooves, which would then be soaked with water, causing the wood to expand and gradually fracture the limestone along predetermined lines, in a process that sounds simple in theory, but requires extraordinary patience, precise planning, and an intimate understanding of how stone responds to controlled stress. Not to mention the fact that even after successfully detaching a 20-ton pillar from the living bedrock, you are still left with the rather significant problem of how to move it anywhere without it cracking, tipping over, or crushing the workers attempting to manipulate it. Modern experimental archaeology, which involves actually attempting to replicate ancient techniques using only the tools and materials that would have been available at the time, has repeatedly demonstrated that moving stones of this size presents challenges that border on the impossible when you limit yourself to the supposed technological toolkit of 10th millennium BCE hunter-gatherers. Because, while it is certainly possible to move large stones using nothing but human muscle power, wooden rollers, sledges, and rope made from plant fibers or animal sinew, the number of people required increases dramatically with the weight of the stone, and the coordination necessary to prevent the stone from shifting unexpectedly and injuring or killing workers requires not just brute strength, but sophisticated organizational skills, clear communication systems, and probably some form of specialized knowledge passed down through master-apprentice relationships, all of which implies a level of social complexity that sits very uncomfortably with our traditional image of Neolithic hunter-gatherers as small, egalitarian bands moving seasonally across the landscape. The mathematics of moving a 20-ton stone using only human power and primitive technology become quite sobering when you actually work through the calculations. Because even under ideal conditions, on flat ground, with well-constructed wooden rollers and adequate rope, you would need somewhere between 100 and 200 people pulling in coordinated unison just to overcome the static friction and get the stone moving. And this assumes perfect cooperation, ideal weather conditions, robust rope that doesn't snap under the load, rollers that don't splinter or sink into soft ground, and a relatively level path from quarry to construction site, none of which can be taken for granted, and the path from the quarry to the various enclosures at Göbekli Tepe is most definitely not flat, but rather includes elevation changes and uneven terrain that would multiply the difficulty exponentially, potentially requiring twice or even 3 times as many workers, along with elaborate systems of ramps, supports, and probably some method of preventing catastrophic backward sliding when hauling stones uphill. Even more perplexing than the transportation challenge is the question of how these massive pillars were raised into vertical positions with such precision that many of them have remained standing without any visible mortar or metal reinforcement for more than 11 millennia. Because erecting a 20-ton T-shaped stone pillar so that it stands perfectly upright requires not just brute force, but also sophisticated engineering knowledge, probably involving the excavation of a carefully shaped pit, the construction of earthen ramps to allow the pillar to be dragged or rolled into position, an elaborate system of ropes and perhaps wooden supports to control the descent of the pillar into the pit, and then the careful backfilling and tamping of earth around the base to lock it into position. All of which must be accomplished without the benefit of metal tools to dig with, surveying instruments to check angles, or any of the mechanical advantages that later civilizations would develop to make such tasks more manageable. The precision with which these pillars were positioned becomes even more remarkable when you consider that many of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe display clear geometric patterns, with pillars arranged in circles or ovals that deviate only slightly from perfect mathematical forms. And the two central pillars in each enclosure are often aligned with remarkable accuracy to specific compass directions or astronomical phenomena, suggesting that the builders possessed not only practical construction skills, but also mathematical and astronomical knowledge sophisticated enough to inform architectural planning. Which raises the uncomfortable question of how such knowledge could have developed and been transmitted across generations by people who supposedly had no writing system, no permanent educational institutions, no libraries or archives, and no settled communities where elderly experts could train young apprentices in complex technical skills over many years. The artistic elements of the pillars compound the engineering mystery rather than resolving it, because the three-dimensional animal reliefs that adorn many of the stones are not simple scratched outlines, but rather sophisticated sculptures that show accurate anatomical knowledge, artistic skill in representing perspective and proportion, and technical ability in working stone to create depth and texture, with individual feathers visible on vultures, musculature correctly depicted on felines, and compositional arrangements that suggest deliberate aesthetic choices rather than random decoration. And these carvings must have been created either before the pillars were erected, which means carving detailed reliefs while the stone lay flat, and then successfully moving and raising it without damaging the artwork, or after erection, which means artists somehow worked on vertical or even overhanging surfaces while perched on scaffolding or ladders constructed from organic materials that have long since rotted away, without leaving clear archaeological traces. The presence of such sophisticated artistic work at Göbekli Tepe necessarily implies the existence of specialist craftspeople who devoted significant portions of their lives developing and practicing stone carving skills, which, in turn, implies a social system that could support such specialists by providing them with food, shelter, and tools while they pursued their craft, rather than engaging in direct food production. And this implication becomes even more significant when you multiply one specialist carver by the dozens or perhaps hundreds of similar specialists who would have been needed to produce all the carved pillars across all the enclosures at the site. Not to mention the additional specialists in stone quarrying, pillar transportation, architectural planning, and construction coordination, creating a picture of labor specialization and social stratification that simply should not exist among supposedly egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands who lived hand to mouth and possessed no means of accumulating and storing the substantial food surpluses that would be necessary to support a class of non-food-producing specialists. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry surveys of the areas surrounding the excavated enclosures have revealed the presence of at least 20 additional circular structures still buried beneath the surface, suggesting that what has been uncovered so far represents perhaps 5% or less of the total construction at the site. And, if each of these enclosures required decades of sustained labor by hundreds of workers, as seems likely given the scale and complexity of the structures, then the total investment of human effort, represented by Göbekli Tepe as a whole, becomes almost incomprehensible, potentially representing thousands of person-years of labor spread across multiple generations, which raises the absolutely critical question of what could possibly motivate such an enormous expenditure of resources and human effort by people who, supposedly, had no kings to command them, no state apparatus to organize and compel their labor, and no apparent immediate survival benefit to be gained from building these monuments, instead of focusing their energies on obtaining food, creating shelter, and reproducing. The pattern of construction, use, and deliberate burial that characterizes Göbekli Tepe becomes even more puzzling when examined from an engineering perspective, because after investing decades, or perhaps even generations of labor into quarrying, transporting, erecting, and carving these massive stone pillars, the builders apparently used each enclosure for some period of time before carefully and deliberately filling it with debris and soil, then building a new enclosure on top of or adjacent to the buried one, repeating this pattern multiple times, in a way that suggests the burial was not an ending, but rather part of an ongoing cycle of construction, use, burial, and renewal that may have continued for more than 1,000 years. And from an engineering standpoint, this pattern is utterly baffling, because it means the builders were not simply trying to create durable structures, long-term use, as virtually every other civilization has done with their monumental architecture, but rather were engaging in something more like a continuous process of creation and concealment that served purposes we can barely begin to comprehend. Modern engineers and construction professionals who visit Göbekli Tepe and seriously study the structural elements and construction techniques often express a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. Because even with all the advantages of modern materials, equipment, and engineering knowledge, replicating what was accomplished there would still present significant challenges. And the fact that it was accomplished by people using exclusively stone tools, organic ropes, wooden implements, and human muscle power verges on the impossible, unless we are missing something crucial about either the tools they possessed or the techniques they employed, or perhaps the number of people they could marshal for these projects. And each of these possibilities requires us to substantially revise our understanding of Neolithic society in ways that make many archaeologists and historians deeply uncomfortable, because they threaten the carefully constructed narratives about human progress that have dominated academic discourse for the past century. The absence of any evidence for metal tools at Göbekli Tepe has been confirmed through extensive analysis of tool marks on the stones and the complete lack of any metal artifacts in the archaeological layers associated with the site's construction, which means we can be reasonably certain that everything accomplished there was done using stone hammers and chisels, wooden levers and sledges, and rope made from plant fibers or animal tissues. A toolkit that seems almost laughably inadequate when placed against the scale and sophistication of what was actually built. Roughly equivalent to expecting someone to construct a modern skyscraper using only hand tools from the medieval period. And yet, The evidence is undeniable that something was accomplished at Göbekli Tepe that pushes the boundaries of what we believed possible for people of that era, suggesting that perhaps we have been consistently underestimating the capabilities of our ancestors. Or perhaps that the development of technological capability in human history has not been the smooth upward curve we like to imagine, but rather something more complex and discontinuous, with periods of remarkable achievement followed by periods of loss and forgetting. The sheer scale of the engineering challenges at Göbekli Tepe, when combined with the site's extreme antiquity and the supposed primitiveness of the people who built it, creates a cognitive dissonance so severe that many scholars have struggled to accept the implications, preferring instead to search for alternative explanations that might preserve the traditional timeline and model of human development. But the physical evidence stubbornly refuses to cooperate with comfortable narratives. And as more of the site is excavated, and as more similar sites are discovered in the surrounding region, it becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss Göbekli Tepe as an anomaly or a fluke, forcing us instead to confront the possibility that the people who built these monuments were fundamentally different from what we have imagined, possessing capabilities and knowledge that challenge everything we thought we knew about the progression from primitive to civilized, and demanding that we ask the question that leads inevitably into the next chapter. Who exactly were these people? These supposedly simple hunter-gatherers who somehow organized themselves to accomplish engineering feats that would challenge even modern construction crews. And where did they acquire the skills, knowledge, and social organization necessary to transform raw stone into monuments that have outlasted empires and civilizations that came thousands of years after them? Traditional narrative of human development that has dominated archaeological and anthropological thought for more than a century follows a progression so logical and so apparently self-evident that it has taken on the quality of natural law in the minds of scholars and laypeople alike. Beginning with small nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers, numbering perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, who moved seasonally across landscapes following migrating animal herds and ripening plant resources, living in temporary camps that left minimal archaeological traces, possessing essentially egalitarian social structures with no permanent leaders or specialized roles, beyond perhaps a loose division of labor based on age and sex, and spending virtually all of their time and energy on the immediate concerns of finding food, avoiding predators, creating rudimentary shelter, and caring for children, with little capacity for long-term planning, accumulated knowledge, or the kind of sustained cooperative labor that characterizes more complex societies. According to this comfortable and widely accepted model, these hunter-gatherer bands would have been limited not just by their technology, but by their social organization, lacking the hierarchical structures necessary to coordinate large groups of people toward common goals, lacking the surplus resources necessary to support individuals who did not contribute directly to food acquisition, lacking the permanent settlements that would allow for the gradual accumulation of material culture and specialized knowledge, and lacking any compelling reason to invest scarce resources into projects that did not provide immediate survival benefits. Which is why the conventional wisdom holds that monumental architecture, specialized labor roles, artistic traditions, and complex religious systems only emerged after the development of agriculture created the food surpluses and permanent settlements that made such cultural elaborations possible. A neat and tidy progression that places agriculture as the necessary precondition for everything we associate with civilization. Göbekli Tepe demolishes this narrative with the blunt force of a 20-ton stone pillar. Because everything about the site screams the existence of a social organization orders of magnitude more complex than what supposedly existed in the 10th millennium BCE, requiring not just dozens, but hundreds of workers laboring in coordinated fashion over spans of time measured in decades or generations, necessitating leadership structures sophisticated enough to plan, organize, and direct this labor without the coercive apparatus of state power, demanding the existence of specialist roles, including architects who could envision and plan these structures, engineers who understood the mechanics of moving and erecting massive stones, master stone carvers who possessed the artistic skill to create the sophisticated reliefs that adorn the pillars, apprentices who learned these skills over many years of training, and perhaps most problematically, some system for feeding, housing, and supporting all these workers and specialists while they engaged in labor that produced no immediate survival benefit in terms of food, water, or shelter. The mathematics of feeding several hundred people on a sustained basis becomes a serious problem when you are dealing with a supposedly nomadic population living in temporary camps. Because modern studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies suggest that, even in relatively resource-rich environments, each person requires several hours per day of foraging or hunting activity to meet their caloric needs. And while you might be able to pull individuals away from food procurement for brief periods to work on communal projects, sustaining hundreds of workers for the months or years required to quarry, transport, erect, and carve even a single enclosure at Göbekli Tepe would require either an impossibly abundant natural food supply that allowed most people to meet their needs with minimal effort, leaving surplus time for construction work, or, alternatively, it would require some form of organized food production and storage that looks suspiciously like agriculture, even though the conventional timeline places the development of agriculture in this region several centuries after the construction of Göbekli Tepe began, creating a chicken and egg paradox that has vexed researchers since the site's discovery. Archaeological evidence from Göbekli Tepe itself provides tantalizing and deeply problematic clues about how this feeding challenge might have been addressed, including massive deposits of animal bones that bear clear evidence of butchering and cooking, representing the remains of communal feasts that apparently brought together large numbers of people for periodic gatherings and celebrations, with gazelle bones being particularly abundant, along with wild cattle, wild pigs, and various bird species, suggesting that whoever organized the construction of these monuments also organized large-scale hunting expeditions, or perhaps even engaged in early forms of animal management that fell somewhere between pure hunting and full domestication, corralling or herding wild animals in ways that would ensure a steady supply of meat for the workers and participants, without requiring the years of selective breeding that would eventually produce fully domesticated livestock. A kind of intermediate strategy that leaves almost no clear archaeological signature and is therefore largely invisible in the historical record, despite potentially being crucial to understanding how pre-agricultural societies could accomplish what Göbekli Tepe represents. The presence of what appear to be specialized artist craftspeople at Göbekli Tepe poses particularly severe problems for our understanding of Neolithic social organization, because the quality and consistency of the stone carving work across multiple pillars and multiple enclosures strongly suggests that these were not casual doodlings created by workers during their lunch breaks, but rather the products of individuals who had devoted substantial portions of their lives to developing and refining their skills in working stone, understanding animal anatomy, and creating aesthetically compelling compositions. And the existence of such specialists necessarily implies a social system that valued and supported non-productive labor in the economic sense, willing to provide food, tools, and materials to individuals whose contribution to the community came in the form of artistic or religious expression rather than calories acquired through hunting or gathering, which is precisely the kind of cultural elaboration and resource allocation that we associate with settled agricultural societies rather than nomadic hunter-gatherers operating at the margins of subsistence. The artistic sophistication displayed on the pillars at Göbekli Tepe deserves particular attention because it is not merely competent but genuinely excellent by any standard, with three-dimensional animal sculptures that demonstrate accurate anatomical knowledge, confident artistic execution, and compositional sensibilities that suggest these carvers were not learning on the job, but rather working within an established artistic tradition with recognized standards and techniques passed down from master to apprentice across multiple generations. And the animals depicted include species from widely separated ecological zones, including mountain lions and leopards that would have inhabited rocky highlands, wild boars and foxes from forested areas, gazelles from open grasslands, and waterfowl from riverine or wetland environments, suggesting either that the carvers possessed extensive knowledge of animals from diverse habitats through extensive travelling and observation, or alternatively, that Göbekli Tepe served as a gathering place for people from across wide geographical area, each perhaps contributing their local animal symbolism to a shared sacred space, either of which implies social networks and information exchange systems far more complex than what we typically associate with small, isolated hunter-gatherer bands. The architectural consistency across multiple enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, with the repeated pattern of two large central pillars surrounded by smaller pillars arranged in circular or oval configurations, demonstrates not random experimentation, but rather adherence to a specific design template that was apparently maintained across generations of construction, suggesting the existence of what we might call an architectural tradition or building code that specified how these sacred spaces should be configured, and the preservation and transmission of such architectural knowledge without the benefit of written plans, technical drawings, or permanent educational institutions represents a remarkable feat of cultural continuity that requires us to radically upgrade our estimates of the sophistication of oral tradition and institutional memory in pre-literate societies, acknowledging that the absence of writing does not necessarily imply the absence of complex, systematic knowledge, merely that such knowledge was encoded and transmitted through different mechanisms, including, perhaps, ritual performances, songs, stories, apprenticeship relationships, and direct, hands-on training that left no permanent record for archaeologists to discover thousands of years later. The question of political and social organization at Göbekli Tepe becomes particularly vexing when we try to imagine how several hundred people could be coordinated and directed in sustained labor without the apparatus of state power, without kings or chiefs who could command obedience through threat of violence or promise of reward, without bureaucratic systems for tracking contributions and distributing resources, and without the social stratification that characterizes virtually every complex society known to history. Because while egalitarian groups can certainly accomplish impressive feats through voluntary cooperation when faced with immediate threats or opportunities, sustaining such cooperation across decades or generations for projects that provide no obvious material benefit requires either an extraordinary degree of ideological commitment or, alternatively, suggests that the social organization was not nearly as egalitarian as the hunter-gatherer label implies, with some individuals or lineages possessing authority and prestige sufficient to initiate and direct these massive construction projects, which in turn implies the existence of social hierarchy, inherited status, and probably competition for prestige and power, all of which are supposed to emerge only after the development of agriculture and settled villages, according to the traditional model. The only explanation that has gained any real traction among serious scholars for why people would invest such enormous effort into building Göbekli Tepe is that the motivation was fundamentally religious or ideological rather than practical, that the structures served as temples or ritual centers where large numbers of people gathered periodically to participate in ceremonies, celebrations, and communal activities that reinforced shared beliefs and social bonds, creating what some researchers have called a cathedral on a hill that drew pilgrims from across a wide region. And while this explanation has the virtue of accounting for both the scale of the investment and the lack of obvious practical function, it also requires us to accept that religious or ideological motivations were powerful enough to organize and sustain complex societies even before the development of agriculture, essentially flipping the traditional causal arrow that runs from material conditions to social organization to ideological superstructure, and suggesting, instead, that in some cases the ideological commitment came first and actually drove the development of the social and economic structures necessary to realize it. Religion creating civilization, rather than civilization creating religion. Modern parallels might help make this seemingly bizarre proposition more comprehensible, because we can look at the medieval European cathedrals that took centuries to build, consuming the labor of thousands of workers and craftspeople across multiple generations, driven entirely by religious faith and the desire to create spaces worthy of divine presence. Or we might think of how Burning Man, that contemporary festival in the Nevada desert, manages to create a temporary city of 70,000 people, complete with infrastructure, art installations, and elaborate social organization, all through voluntary participation motivated by shared cultural values rather than economic necessity or state compulsion. Except that the crucial difference is that medieval cathedral builders had cities, agriculture, metal tools, written architectural plans, and established social hierarchies to draw upon, while Burning Man participants arrive in vehicles using existing roads and bring supplies purchased with money earned in the regular economy, whereas the builders of Göbekli Tepe supposedly had none of these advantages, making their achievement proportionally more impressive and more difficult to explain within conventional frameworks. The astronomical knowledge that appears to be encoded in the orientation and arrangement of structures at Göbekli Tepe adds yet another layer of complexity to our understanding of these supposedly primitive people. Because several researchers have noted that pillars and enclosures appear to be aligned with specific celestial phenomena, including solstices and equinoxes. And some have argued that the site as a whole functioned as a kind of astronomical observatory or calendar system, allowing the builders to track the movements of sun, moon, and stars with precision sufficient to predict seasonal changes and coordinate communal gatherings. And if these interpretations are correct, then we must credit the builders with systematic astronomical observation spanning multiple generations. Mathematical sophistication sufficient to calculate and implement architectural alignments, and institutional continuity sufficient to maintain and transmit this knowledge across decades or centuries. All of which implies the existence of a specialized priesthood or knowledge keeper class who devoted their lives to celestial observation and the maintenance of astronomical architectural knowledge. The challenge of transmitting complex, technical, and ritual knowledge across generations without writing becomes even more daunting when we consider that the construction of Göbekli Tepe apparently spanned more than 1,000 years, meaning that the individuals who completed the later enclosures were separated by 40 or 50 generations from those who initiated the first constructions, and maintaining architectural consistency, artistic standards, and presumably ritual practices across such vast spans of time requires extraordinary institutional stability and effective mechanisms for cultural transmission, suggesting that perhaps we have been systematically underestimating the sophistication and effectiveness of oral tradition, ritual performance, and apprenticeship systems in pre-literate societies. Assuming that, without writing, people must have been essentially unable to maintain complex bodies of knowledge or sustain cultural traditions across deep time, when in fact the evidence from Göbekli Tepe suggests exactly the opposite. The population density question becomes particularly acute when we try to reconcile the labor requirements of Göbekli Tepe with current archaeological models of Neolithic population distribution in the region. Because if you need several hundred workers at any given time to sustain construction activities, and if these workers are drawn from nomadic hunter-gatherer bands numbering 20 to 50 individuals each, then you would need somewhere between 10 and 25 bands to converge on the site. And if these bands maintained their normal foraging patterns while contributing labor to the construction project, they would need to be dispersed across a territory large enough to support their food acquisition needs while remaining close enough to Göbekli Tepe to make regular participation feasible. And the mathematics of this arrangement become increasingly strained the more carefully you examine them, suggesting either that population densities in this region were far higher than current models assume, or that the people involved were not actually nomadic hunter-gatherers in the conventional sense, but rather represented some intermediate form of social organization that combined elements of mobility and sedentism in ways that leave ambiguous archaeological signatures. The genetic evidence from ancient remains in the region, while still fragmentary and subject to ongoing research and debate, adds another fascinating dimension to the mystery by suggesting that the populations living in southeastern Anatolia during the period when Göbekli Tepe was constructed were not the direct ancestors of later agricultural populations in the region, but rather represent genetic lineages that have no clear modern descendants, implying population replacements or movements that occurred sometime after the site was deliberately buried, raising the haunting possibility that the people who built these monuments either moved elsewhere or died out, or were absorbed into other populations, taking with them whatever knowledge and social structures allowed them to accomplish what they did, and leaving us with only the mute testimony of carved stones and buried temples to hint at capabilities and achievements that challenge everything we thought we understood about human history. The more carefully we examine the people question at Göbekli Tepe, the more we are forced to confront the inadequacy of our categories and labels. Because calling these people hunter-gatherers, when they were clearly organizing large-scale labor projects and creating monumental architecture, seems to miss something essential about who they were and what they were capable of. And yet, they do not fit comfortably into the category of civilized either, lacking cities, writing, metallurgy, and many other features we associate with civilization, suggesting that perhaps our binary distinction between primitive and civilized is far too crude to capture the actual diversity of human social organizations that have existed across history, and that we need new conceptual frameworks and new vocabulary to describe societies that fell somewhere between the nomadic band and the urban state. Societies that could coordinate hundreds of people in sustained labor, support specialized craftspeople and knowledge keepers, maintain complex ritual traditions and architectural knowledge across generations, and create monuments that would last for millennia, all without developing the full suite of features we associate with civilization. And the haunting question that propels us forward into the next chapter is whether the astronomical and cosmological knowledge that some researchers claim to see encoded in the stones of Göbekli Tepe might provide the key to understanding not just who these people were, but what they were trying to tell us across the vast gulf of 11,000 years. The most unsettling fact about Göbekli Tepe, more disturbing perhaps than its impossible antiquity or its engineering sophistication, or even the possibility that it encodes warnings about cosmic catastrophes, is that what has been excavated and studied and photographed and analyzed represents at most 5% of what actually exists beneath the surface of that wind-swept hillside in southeastern Turkey, with ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry surveys, and other remote sensing technologies, revealing the presence of at least 20 additional circular enclosures still buried beneath accumulated soil and debris. Structures that may be larger, older, or more elaborately decorated than anything yet uncovered. And yet, the decision has been made by those controlling access to the site to halt major excavation efforts and leave the vast majority of Göbekli Tepe untouched, for what is officially described as preservation for future generations, who will presumably possess better archaeological techniques and technologies, though one cannot help but wonder whether there might be other, less publicly acknowledged reasons for this peculiar reluctance to reveal what lies beneath. The official explanation for leaving 95% of one of the most important archaeological sites ever discovered unexcavated has a certain superficial plausibility, because it is certainly true that archaeological methods have improved dramatically over the past century, and that excavations conducted decades ago often destroyed valuable contextual information that modern techniques could have preserved. And it is also true that once something is excavated, it can never be reburied in exactly the same way, meaning that future researchers will be limited to whatever records and samples were taken during the initial excavation. But this reasoning becomes less convincing when you consider that Göbekli Tepe has already fundamentally rewritten our understanding of human prehistory based on just 5% of the site, and that the remaining 95% might contain evidence that would be even more revolutionary, more paradigm-shattering, and more difficult to reconcile with established narratives about human development, raising the uncomfortable possibility that leaving it buried serves purposes that have more to do with controlling the pace and nature of revelations that challenge academic orthodoxy than with any genuinely scientific concern about preservation. The restrictions on who is permitted to excavate at Göbekli Tepe and what areas they are allowed to investigate have been tightened considerably since Klaus Schmidt's death in 2014, with the Turkish government exercising increasingly stringent control over archaeological activities in the region, partly due to legitimate concerns about looting and damage to national cultural heritage, partly due to the complex political and religious sensitivities that surround any discoveries that might challenge or complicate narratives about the origins of civilization in a region that is sacred to multiple religious traditions, and partly, one suspects, due to awareness that what emerges from sites like Göbekli Tepe has the potential to fundamentally reshape historical narratives in ways that carry political implications far beyond the realm of pure archaeological scholarship. Because if human civilization is older, more geographically dispersed, and more sophisticated in its early phases than current models suggest, then many contemporary claims about cultural primacy and historical continuity would need to be substantially revised. The academic gatekeeping that surrounds research on Göbekli Tepe and similar sites has become a topic of considerable controversy in recent years, with researchers who propose unconventional interpretations of the evidence often finding their work rejected by peer-reviewed journals, their funding applications denied by granting agencies, and their professional reputations damaged by association with ideas that are labelled as fringe or pseudoscientific, regardless of the quality of evidence presented, creating a chilling effect that discourages younger scholars from pursuing research questions that might jeopardize their careers, even if the evidence points in directions that challenge established paradigms. And this dynamic has led to a situation where the most innovative and potentially revolutionary interpretations of sites like Göbekli Tepe often come from researchers outside traditional archaeology, including astronomers, engineers, geologists, and statistical analysts, who bring different methodological approaches and who have less invested in defending the conventional timeline of human development, though their outsider status also makes it easier for mainstream academics to dismiss their contributions without seriously engaging with the evidence they present. The genetic evidence from ancient populations in the Göbekli Tepe region adds another layer of mystery to an already perplexing situation, because DNA analysis of human remains from the relevant time periods shows patterns of population replacement and discontinuity that do not fit comfortably with models of gradual cultural evolution, revealing that the people who inhabited southeastern Anatolia during the period when Göbekli Tepe was constructed were not simply the ancestors of later agricultural populations in the region, but rather represent genetic lineages that appear to have been largely replaced by subsequent population movements, raising the haunting question of what happened to the descendants of the builders, whether they migrated elsewhere, leaving their monuments behind, whether they were displaced or absorbed by incoming groups with different cultural traditions, or whether they simply died out, taking their knowledge and capabilities with them. And the fact that we cannot definitively answer this question despite decades of genetic research suggests that the population history of this region is far more complex and discontinuous than simplified narratives of human progress would suggest. The recent discovery of additional megalithic sites in the broader region surrounding Göbekli Tepe, including Karahan Tepe, which some researchers believe may actually be older, and which features similarly sophisticated stone pillars and carved reliefs, and Bonkuklu Tarla, which displays its own unique architectural features, while clearly belonging to the same broader cultural tradition, has revealed that Göbekli Tepe was not an isolated anomaly or a single miraculous achievement by one particularly ambitious group, but rather was part of a widespread phenomenon, suggesting the existence of what might legitimately be called a civilization, extending across a substantial geographical area, possessing shared architectural traditions, religious or cosmological beliefs, and presumably some form of social organization and communication networks that allowed for the transmission of knowledge and techniques across considerable distances. And yet, this civilization appears in the archaeological record almost fully formed, with no clear precursors, exists for roughly 1,000 years, producing monuments of extraordinary sophistication, and then, apparently, vanishes, leaving behind deliberately buried temples and very little else, a pattern that becomes increasingly difficult to explain through conventional models of gradual cultural evolution. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe and other similar sites around 8000 BCE remains perhaps the single most perplexing aspect of the entire mystery, because the sheer effort required to fill in these massive stone enclosures with thousands of tons of debris and soil would have been almost as impressive as the original construction, suggesting that whatever motivated the burial was considered extremely important by those who undertook it. And the various theories that have been proposed to explain this behavior, ranging from religious transformation and the rejection of old gods, to deliberate preservation of knowledge for future discovery, to concealment of dangerous or sacred information that needed to be protected from the uninitiated, all require us to credit these ancient people with motivations and thought processes far more complex than we typically associate with pre-literate societies. And none of the explanations feel entirely satisfactory when contemplated seriously, leaving open the disturbing possibility that we are fundamentally misunderstanding what we are looking at, that our entire interpretive framework is inadequate to the task of comprehending what Göbekli Tepe actually was, and what it meant to those who built it. The implications of Göbekli Tepe for our understanding of human history extend far beyond the specific question of when monumental architecture first appeared, or how sophisticated Neolithic peoples actually were. Because if we accept that the conventional timeline is wrong, that human capabilities have been consistently underestimated, and that civilization, or something very much like it, existed thousands of years earlier than previously believed, then we must also confront the possibility that this has happened before. That the cycle of rising civilization and catastrophic collapse might have repeated multiple times across the vast expanse of human existence, with each iteration leaving fewer and more ambiguous traces than the last, and that the neat, progressive narrative we have constructed about humanity's steady climb from primitive origins to modern sophistication might be a comforting fiction that obscures a far more complex and disturbing reality, in which knowledge and capability are gained and lost repeatedly, in which catastrophes, both natural and human-made, periodically reset the clock of civilization, and in which we might not be advancing toward unprecedented heights, but rather climbing back toward levels of knowledge and achievement that were attained before and then lost in ways we no longer remember. The personal and professional costs that have been borne by researchers who have championed unconventional interpretations of Göbekli Tepe and similar sites serve as sobering reminders that science, despite its ideals of dispassionate inquiry and following evidence wherever it leads, is practiced by human beings embedded in institutional structures that reward conformity and punish deviation from accepted paradigms, with careers damaged or destroyed, not because the evidence was faulty or the methodology was flawed, but simply because the conclusions were too far outside the boundaries of what the discipline was prepared to accept. And this reality creates a systematic bias in archaeological research toward interpretations that preserve existing frameworks and timelines, even when the evidence increasingly points in other directions, ensuring that paradigm shifts occur only gradually and reluctantly, often only after an entire generation of scholars invested in the old paradigm has retired or died, by which time valuable opportunities for investigation may have been lost, and sites that could have provided crucial evidence may have been destroyed by development, looting, or deliberate concealment. The question of what is buried in the unexcavated 95% of Göbekli Tepe haunts anyone who seriously contemplates the site. Because if the 5% that has been revealed has already demolished conventional timelines and forced radical reassessments of Neolithic capabilities, what might the remaining portions contain that could be even more revolutionary, more challenging to established narratives, or more difficult to reconcile with our self-understanding as a species? And the longer excavation is delayed, and the more restricted access becomes, the more one cannot help but suspect that those controlling the site may fear or anticipate discoveries that would be too disruptive, too paradigm-shattering, or too politically or religiously sensitive to be safely revealed. Whether that means evidence of even greater antiquity, clear proof of sophisticated astronomical or mathematical knowledge, definitive confirmation of catastrophic events memorialized in the carvings, or perhaps something else entirely that we have not yet imagined because our conceptual frameworks are too limited to anticipate what might be possible. The unanswered questions that swirl around Göbekli Tepe like dust devils on the Anatolian plateau seem to multiply rather than diminish as research continues, with each new discovery and each new analysis raising more questions than it answers. And among the most fundamental and disturbing of these questions is why the acceptance of what Göbekli Tepe represents feels so threatening to so many people, both within academia and beyond. Because one might think that evidence of greater human capability and achievement in the distant past would be celebrated as expanding our understanding and revealing previously unsuspected chapters of our collective story. Yet instead, it often provokes resistance, hostility, and determined efforts to minimize its significance or explain it away, suggesting that there is something about the implications of Göbekli Tepe that challenges not just scholarly theories, but deeper assumptions about human nature, progress, and our place in history, that people are reluctant to question or abandon, even in the face of increasingly compelling evidence. The final, and perhaps most unsettling observation that emerges from a serious contemplation of Göbekli Tepe and what it represents, is that we have spent approximately 11,000 years, roughly 400 human generations, supposedly advancing from the primitive hunter-gatherers who built these monuments to our current state of technological sophistication and accumulated knowledge. Yet despite all our computers and cranes and scientific instruments and libraries and universities, we still cannot definitively explain how Göbekli Tepe was built, cannot fully replicate the techniques used to quarry and erect its massive pillars, cannot decode with certainty what its builders were trying to communicate through their carvings and astronomical alignments, and cannot even agree on the basic question of who these people were and what their society looked like, which suggests either that we are missing something crucial about human capabilities in the past, or that our vaunted progress might be more limited and more fragile than we like to believe. That perhaps we are not standing at the pinnacle of human achievement, looking back at our primitive ancestors, but rather are somewhere in the middle of a long and cyclical journey, climbing back toward heights that were achieved before, lost in catastrophes we no longer remember, and might be achieved and lost again if we do not learn the lessons that are literally carved in stone, waiting for us to decipher them. The truly shocking thought that Göbekli Tepe forces us to confront, the idea that haunts the imagination long after you have left the site and returned to the comfortable certainties of modern life, is that this might not be the first time that human civilization has risen to significant heights of knowledge and capability, that the cycle of achievement and catastrophic loss might have repeated multiple times across the hundreds of thousands of years that anatomically modern humans have existed on this planet. That Göbekli Tepe itself might represent not the first flowering of human civilization, but rather a recovery phase following an even earlier catastrophe that destroyed an even more sophisticated predecessor culture. And that we might be living not in the unprecedented age of enlightenment we imagine, but rather in one iteration of a repeating pattern, climbing toward a peak we have reached before and will reach again, only to lose it all once more when the next catastrophe strikes. Whether that catastrophe comes from the skies in the form of comets and asteroids, from the Earth in the form of supervolcanoes and climate shifts, or from ourselves in the form of war and environmental destruction, leaving behind only fragmentary traces and buried monuments for whatever survivors remain to puzzle over, to misinterpret, and eventually, if they are lucky and determined and humble enough to learn from the past, to finally understand as warnings, carved in stone by ancestors who knew exactly what we are only beginning to suspect. That everything we build, everything we know, and everything we think makes us advanced and secure can be swept away in an instant, leaving future generations to start over from nearly nothing, climbing back toward knowledge that was once possessed and then lost, again and again, across the vast and terrible expanse of human time.